nation where much of the world still looks at the United States and says it has no legitimacy in claiming to be the home of human rights, when 39 men are still held, when none of these men have had due process, when many of the people imprisoned at Guantanamo were tortured, and it's documented how they were tortured. This is completely immoral, unjust, illegitimate, and unacceptable. And we stand here today in 2022 with 4 presidents who have had a role in this. The first president opened it. The second president said he was going to close it, but did not do so in 8 years. The third president said, I'm going to keep it open and bring more people into it. No. The current president said a year ago and on his campaign that he was closing Guantanamo. What has happened? Not enough. Guantanamo is still open. Money is being put into infrastructure. I heard, and one of our speakers may be able to confirm, that a new courtroom is being built for the sham military commissions process, which is not due process. So we're here today to tell the world, and most importantly, the people responsible in the United States for keeping this torture camp open, to close Guantanamo now. Close it! No more talking about it. Close it. My name is Deborah Sweet with World Can't Wait. We're going to be joined in a moment by several people who have been in this battle all the way for a very long time, and we really appreciate them coming out and you all coming out today in the cold. I'd like to introduce first Nancy Hollander, an attorney, and not just an attorney sitting in her office, but attorney who fought for Chelsea Manning, who fights every day for men imprisoned in Guantanamo, including helping to win the freedom of Mohamedou Slahi. This is a very important contribution to this movement. While we've been out on the street for 20-some years now, freezing and protesting, the role of these attorneys is extremely important. So please give a listen to Nancy Hollander. I speak for my clients. I speak for the 39 men who are still in Guantanamo. Only 12 of them have ever been even charged with a crime. The others have never been charged. People don't realize this. They've been held for almost 20 years, some of them for 20 years, never charged with any crime in the United States of America. When President Bush decided to put the prison in Guantanamo, on Guantanamo Bay, he did so because he thought no one will ever know, there'll be no lawyers, they have no rights, that none of the conventions apply, we can do anything we want to them. And they had no end game. They simply brought them there. They dropped leaflets, and I have one of the leaflets. They dropped leaflets that said, turn in a terrorist, make $5,000. They dropped those leaflets all over Afghanistan and Pakistan, and people turned them in. These were not people on a battlefield. These were not people who were fighting the United States. Only a few, and those few are facing trial. But this is not really a trial. It's not a military trial. Military trials are just like the trials everywhere else. They have due process.
These are not military trials. These were made up just for this purpose, and now, all these years later, they still aren't anywhere near being tried. One of them is my client, Ibrahim Al-Nasri. He's been there since 2006, but he was captured in 2002. He was taken to black sites, tortured in ways that if you think about 16th century, then you know how these men were tortured. And then brought to Guantanamo and still there. Mohamedou al-Salahi got out finally, even though the judge ordered him released in 2010, and he didn't get out till 2016. There is no choice. Guantanamo must close.
Yes.
Must close.
Yes.
Let's not forget that President Bush, who originally said, or Cheney said, these are the worst of the worst, 780 men, and then he released 500. Obama released about 124. He said he would close it, and he didn't. President Biden said he would close it, and it's now been, what, a year, almost a year? He's done nothing to close it. These men have to be released. Every one, that's not a process of just opening the doors. Where are they going to go? Some can't go home. It won't be safe. They have to make arrangements to go to other countries. The U.S. has to make arrangements to provide for them when they get there. This is not a simple task, but it must start. And so we can lock this prison and go away from it. The U.S., it's illegal to torture anyone. It's immoral. Torture cannot be used in any time, not even in the middle of war. And yet these men were tortured by agents of the United States, by the Department of Defense, by the CIA. This is what we have in the U.S. today. If you don't like it, tell your senators, tell your congressmen, tell anyone who can get close to President Biden that it must close today. The process must start today. And if you want to know more about Guantanamo, watch the movie The Mauritanian about Mohamedou al-Salahi. Watch the movie. It's his voice. It's his voice with which I speak today to say that we must stand up for due process. We must stand up for the rights of every person, because every person in the world has dignity and must be treated fairly, must be cared for, if they're to have trials, they must have due process. Their rights must be protected. All of us are guilty if we do nothing. We must all do something, even if it's just to tell your next door neighbor. You must do something so we can get this prison closed. And thank you all for standing here in the cold.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Can you imagine having to defend your client by flying to another country where U.S. law doesn't apply, and then putting all your notes into a secret place and having the government go over them and really having your hands tied and still fighting for your clients? We really appreciate the attorneys who have gone through this.
Yes.
Our friend Seth Farber is an attorney, but he's here in his role as a blogger, having written for almost 20 years now about Guantanamo on his blog, The Talking Dog. Seth.
Good? Good. On the morning of the September 11th attacks, one could not have imagined that the United States response to those attacks would include the rounding up of Muslim men and boys from all over the planet, shipping them to an obscure naval base in Cuba and torturing them. One could certainly not imagine that 2 decades later, dozens of men would still be held there, most never charged with any crime, while of those few who have been charged, not a single 9/11 planner has been tried. And yet, here we are. Now we must do more than imagine the end of this travesty. We must finally get our president to actually close this down. Who am I? Why am I here? I'm an attorney here in New York City. I write a blog named after an animal that rhymes with blog. It's been around since a week after 9/11, and I will tell you that I never expected that such an amazing story of outrageous conduct, the pure evil of torture, the sheer incompetence plus evil of holding hundreds of men who may have been responsible for 9/11, but in fact overwhelmingly did nothing, would have generated so little interest from the commercial media that there was an opening for someone like myself just writing a blog to cover this story. But it turned out that the opening was so big that I could end up publishing over 80 interviews with former detainees, military commissioned prosecutors, defense attorneys, Guantanamo guards, other personnel there, government officials, journalists, activists, and habeas attorneys, many habeas attorneys. One of those habeas attorneys, Candace Gorman from Chicago, let me look over her shoulder and occasionally make suggestions as she represented a Libyan man named Abdel al-Jazawi, held at Guantanamo for about 10 years for the crime of running a bakery shop in Afghanistan while Arab, and an Algerian man named Said Bakouche, who is still held as a forever prisoner, the insane category pronounced by Barack Obama of unable to try but too dangerous to release, as if that's actually a thing. His crime was guilty by guest house, having been in the same guest house in Pakistan for a matter of days as another prisoner named Zain al-Abidin Muhammad Hussein, better known as Abu Zubaydah, another forever prisoner. We'll talk about both shortly, but back to our story. Turning back the clock to that pivotal moment when I first look out my office window on Church Street in Lower Manhattan on a sunny Tuesday morning exactly 20 years and 4 months ago, and I saw flames shooting out of the World Trade Center North Tower, and then saw glass and paper falling down, I had no idea what was coming next. In the short run, I had no idea that in an hour, another plane would crash into the other tower of the World Trade Center, another into the Pentagon, another into Pennsylvania. I had no idea both towers would implode, that nearly 3,000 people would be dead by the end of the morning. But by the time I got home to Brooklyn, all the TV networks preempted everything to cover this. And interestingly, the networks were broadcasting photos and the names of the suspected hijackers and where they boarded. My wife said rather presciently that a whole lot of people who don't deserve it are going to die now. And I hung my head a bit, knowing that the way American policy works, she was absolutely right. My daughter wasn't 2 at the time. She's now 22, having grown up in a country that has always been at war, a country that always argued that torture was okay. And if it's not okay, we certainly weren't going to do anything to hold anyone accountable for it. Her generation simply has no awareness that things were ever different. What neither I or anyone else could have expected is that in the course of a limited military incursion in Afghanistan, the Bush administration would end up vacuuming men and boys picked up in that conflict, and then later from Africa, Europe, elsewhere in Asia, most of them literally purchased for cash bounties from Afghan warlords, Pakistani police, or whoever was selling, shipped them to a hastily constructed military prison on the eastern edge of Cuba. And I don't know who would have anticipated that the same president would have decided that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to the men captured in that war, that it was now a global war on terror, as if that could even happen. Of course, once one starts down this rabbit hole, it isn't hard to imagine a smug law professor working for the administration might throw legal terms around and decide that despite every international and domestic law to the contrary, torture was now legal. And since we were in something called a war, we could do whatever we liked to whomever we captured. Why not have the president appoint a judge, jury, and executioner, make up legal rules and laws, including crimes, and decide he can charge, convict, and if he wanted to, execute prisoners? And what better place to bring it all together than a base in Cuba, a communist country that, despite American control for over 100 years, we still claim has sovereignty over the base, and therefore is conveniently beyond the range and jurisdiction of American courts. And who would have expected that that prison would ultimately hold around 800 men and would generate 3 separate lawsuits that ended up in the United States Supreme Court? That the prisoners would win every single one of them, including that they had a right to bring habeas cases, the right to have counsel, the right to the equivalent of Geneva Convention status hearings, the right to military commission trials at least properly created by Congress rather than made up by the executive. And who would have expected that despite these landmark Supreme Court cases, and despite a man I once knew as Barry Obama, my college classmate from Columbia, somehow got elected President of the United States on a campaign that included closing Guantanamo as a centerpiece, and then even issuing an executive order promising to close it on its first full day in office. And despite all of this, Guantanamo, the prison, and Guantanamo, the kangaroo court military trials continue to grind on, both bogged down by the legacy of torture to this very day. But here we are. Let me give you some breaking news. There are 2 developments of note. First, Saeed Bakoush is scheduled to have his periodic review board hearing today, literally right at this moment, ironically scheduled for the 20th anniversary of the opening of the prison, where the government will determine if he can be cleared for transfer home to Algeria. And as to Abu Zubaydah, there's also news. His name might be familiar to you. He is a man who our government erroneously believed was a senior Al-Qaeda figure and subjected to unimaginable tortures, including being waterboarded at least 83 times, forced into stress positions, locked inside coffins and other small confined boxes, deprived of food, sleep, and clothing, and physically assaulted. That's just the Cliff Notes version. Indeed, just yesterday, the government of Lithuania, host of a CIA black site where Zubaydah was tortured, paid him compensation of 100,000 euros. Although, as he's still held at Guantanamo as a forever prisoner, I'm not sure who will get to cash the check. His torture is also the subject of a recent Supreme Court argument on state secrets, another doctrine that Guantanamo has moved into overdrive in the last 20 years. That will be the 4th time a Guantanamo prisoner has a case that made it to the Supreme Court. Only this time the justices themselves acknowledged he was tortured. Not enhanced interrogation, but torture. And I suspect, regardless of the outcome, unless something dramatic and different happens, I fear that Guantanamo will trundle on as it has for the last 20 years, even as we continue to pay over $13 million a prisoner each year to keep the place open. But the one thing no one could have expected either, but which I tell you is the good news, maybe the only good news, is that so many of you, so many people of goodwill are still interested in the plight of a few dozen Muslim men held in Cuba and a few hundred more who received the Guantanamo experience and have been transferred to countries around the world. Enough that after 20 years, you're all still campaigning and fighting and engaging in activism or pursuing habeas cases, despite the fact that the judicial system seems to have largely given up on being a check on the executive, or thanks to those few intrepid journalists still pursuing the story. Here we are. This story has been a slow-motion train wreck for 20 years now, and it's about time it's had its final chapter. Joe Biden has released the same number of prisoners from Guantanamo that Donald Trump did. 1. It's a welcome development, but it's tiny. On the other hand, the Biden administration has cleared 8 or 9 prisoners for transfer against only 1 cleared by Trump administration. And just within the last 24 hours, cleared a prisoner who had been held at a CIA black site, which hasn't happened before. For another, Another cause for optimism is that President Biden stood up to the military-industrial complex and finally withdrew the United States from its longest war in Afghanistan, despite the political cost and bad optics. By the way, the end of that war probably means the last vestiges of any legal excuse to hold prisoners from that war probably ended too. I won. Yep, okay. This is no time to ease up. After the 4 long, dark years of the Trump administration, we have a final possible opening here. Let's do all we can to encourage or cajole this president at this time to finally do the right thing, close Guantanamo and end this sad chapter in our history once and for all. Close Guantanamo now. Thank you.
I say close Guantanamo, you say now. Close Guantanamo. Close Guantanamo. Close Guantanamo. Close Guantanamo. Close Guantanamo. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
All day we've been hearing from a number of former prisoners in Guantanamo who have varied stories to tell but are so interesting to hear from. Everyone from Nancy Hollander's client, Mohamedou Slahi, across the board, people with different experiences, different languages, different lives. But they've all communicated to us today that it was very important to have voices fighting for them, including people on the streets. And I know people standing with me here right now have been on the streets for many years demanding that Guantanamo be closed. We're going to hear from one of them right now, Jeremy Varone of Witness Against Torture.
Thanks so much, Deb. So the sun is setting and the temperature is falling, so I will try to keep my comments brief. It's been 20 long years since the opening of Guantanamo. This is my 17th year protesting on January 11th, a sad day that it opened. Normally in Washington, D.C., this is my first time in New York, and let me say that the turnout is absolutely astounding, rivaling national mobilizations we've had in years past on January 11th. And, who couldn't be inspired, who could not be inspired to see that so many everyday people, some new to this issue, some veterans of this issue, care enough to come out on a freezing cold day, to say with power and passion, close Guantanamo. Now, I could, reflect on a 2-decade-long legacy of torture and human rights violation at Guantanamo, indeed a legacy of shame. I could also reflect on a 2-decade-long legacy of resilience and resistance. The resilience and resistance, first and foremost, of the detained men themselves, but also the resistance of advocates in this country and all over the world who have filed lawsuits and written op-eds and fasted and gotten arrested and engaged in hunger strikes and force feedings to dramatize the barbarism of that practice, who have lobbied and written their congressmen and called radio programs and used everything in the civic toolkit and then some, with the singular goal of bringing freedom to abused and wrongfully detained men and closure to, as Seth described, this sad chapter in American history. And we are participating today in that proud legacy that, again, has brought freedom to people who are incarcerated. This afternoon, I participated in an online event where I saw for the first time Omar Khadr as a free man. Hitherto, he had existed just as an icon to me of horrific and tragic abuse as a 15-year-old brought into Guantanamo. But here he is as a handsome, articulate young man speaking in freedom of the imperative of closing Guantanamo. So I could reflect on shameful legacy. I could reflect on legacies of resistance. What I would like to do is talk just a little bit about the present moment. And then sadly, a lot is being clarified. President Obama and Vice President Harris heroically defeated the fascist monster that is Donald Trump. And we are immensely grateful to them for that. They promised to restore common decency, trust in government, and the rule of law. And they promised also to close Guantanamo. We had reasons to be optimistic. Biden was one of the most vocal senators early on calling for the closure of the prison. Like a proud father, he stood next to Obama when on day one of his administration, he signed an executive order saying that Guantanamo would be closed within a year. Biden is a man of faith and professed principle and decency that detained men themselves have appealed to as somebody who cares about spirit and values. And yet the record of the Biden administration has been worse than pathetic. The number one haunts me. 1 year, roughly, since he took office, promising to close the prison. One man released under his tenure so far. Are they completely inept and incompetent and do not know how to execute their own policy? Are they insincere and have no intention of executing their own policy? Is it some sad and twisted combination of the two? Are they worried about the optics of returning terrorists to the battlefield after the bungled withdrawal from Afghanistan? Is it out of sight? Is it out of mind? Is it that same Obama, we've got this, when you've got nothing but broken promises? Whether we choose to see the administration as allies or adversaries in our struggle doesn't fundamentally matter, but they need to know that we will hold them to account, much as Biden talks about the importance of restoring accountability as part of the broader restoration of the majesty of the rule of law. From Trump, we expected only horrible things. From Biden, we were promised better things. And so far, his record on Guantanamo has been one of almost complete and total abject failure. Now, the good news is our passion and our commitment and their professed commitment to closing Guantanamo. So in principle, at least, they will be responsive to our efforts to pressure them and to reach out to them and appeal to their conscience and appeal to their promises. And sadly, we're in a position where we are going to have to push our presumed ally to do the right thing that they claim they want to do. It's starting to feel like 2009 all over again, but that is no excuse to give up the fight, because the fate of 39 men depends on our efforts and the fate and future of the United States as a country that at its best honors and values certain democratic and legal principles also depends on our actions. So with that, let's get warm and let's keep at it. Thank you.
Close Guantanamo! Now! Close Guantanamo!
No!
Close Guantanamo!
No!
Close Guantanamo!
No!
Close Guantanamo!
No! In 2020, not in 2040, in 2022. We got two messages while we were standing here. One was from the former prisoner Mansour Gaddafi, who is stuck in Serbia in the snow, having grown up in Yemen in the countryside. He's got a book out. Everyone should check that out, and we really appreciating him trying to join today. Also, the journalist Andy Worthington, the author of the book Outside the Law, The Stories of the Men in Guantanamo, called in, and we explained it's cold out here, but we're going to include your video when we edit everything together. I want to say one more thing about Guantanamo that's important for people in this country to understand. It's not just Guantanamo. It's not just those acres in Cuba. It's not only the torture. It's not only detaining people without charge. It's a whole package that goes along with the CIA black sites that swept up people for years and about which we still know very little. It's a whole system of anti-Muslim actions around the world. And it's a military that we learned yesterday in a new study has dropped 46 bombs each day for the last 20 years. Mainly on Muslim people, it turns out, but it is ready to go above the horizon and switch that up at any moment. This is what's illegitimate about a country that is projecting this kind of power around the world in the name of human rights. This is a whole system we have to keep our eyes on, and this has to be changed, and Guantanamo must be closed. To end us out, we're going to have songs from the grannies. They have 2 songs for us. Then we'll have some announcements and other people can share the mic. It's very important we came together today. I want to thank you for standing out here in the cold. The websites are witnesstorture.org, thetalkingdog.com, closeguantanamo.org, worldcan'twait.org, and many more that you will Google and continue to learn much more about the struggle to close Guantanamo. Thank you all. We're going to end with the grannies. I'll take the mask off for this one. If anyone wants a Raging Granny song sheet, sing with us. Come and get it. You can sing with us, but if you don't, you'll catch on very fast. These are the song sheets. Okay, we're going to do Why Are We Silent first, and then we'll do Guantanamo, Let's Shut It Down. Okay, Why Are We Silent? Give them the song sheet, yeah. Why are we silent about Guantanamo? Detention is torture, that we all know. 39 men, we must let them go. Guantanamo must be no more. Guantanamo must be no more. 20 years, tortured brutality, torn from their loved ones indefinitely. Is anything left of our humanity? Guantanamo must be no more. Guantanamo must be no more. Thank you, everyone. And our next song on the other side of the sheet is Guantanamo, Let's Shut It Down. Don't let... Guantanamo, let's shut it down. Shut it down. Shut it down. Guantanamo, let's shut it down. No charges, no trials, brutal and vile. Guantanamo, let's shut it down. Guantanamo, let's shut it down. Shut it down. Shut it down. Guantanamo, let's shut it down. Let's free the 39, end our war crimes. Guantanamo, let's shut it down. Thank you, everyone. Shut it down. One more verse. I didn't write it yet. Did you write it? Shut it down. Shut it down. Shut it down. Guantanamo, let's shut it down. No Guantanamo, let's shut it down. Good one.